Today's episode is brought to you by Mazars. SoundCartel. We have heard ad nauseum about inflation and cost of living pressures ever since the first cash rate hike in May this year. Whether or not your own business is affected by this, have you considered offering pay rises to your own workforce to reflect the rise in inflation? From SoundCartel, I'm Nicole Goodman, and this is Business Essentials Daily. There's a lot to consider when it comes to pay increases. Can you afford it? Do your staff deserve it? And what's the right salary for your industry? For advice, we turn to HR specialist Karen Gately of Corporate Dojo. Chris Ashmore asks Karen, how important is it for business owners to stay on top of industry wages?
Look, I think it's essential understanding what market we're operating in, who are the employers that we're competing with, what are they likely to be paying potential employees is an important way of then being able to be deliberate in the way that we compete for talent. You know, the reality is in order for us to attract and retain great people, then the pay part of the equation is an important one. So, I think maintaining that understanding of where do we sit relative to other employers is the starting point.
How does a business know what the minimum award rate is for their industry, and when it changes, how do they know about that? It can be quite difficult to find out, can't it?
Yeah, I think the starting point, the easiest place to go is to the Fair Work Commission, and their website has a list of all of the different awards and you can tap into that information. You can also register for alerts where you're getting updated on when there are changes. And I think obviously understanding the award is just the starting point. That's the minimum that we need to be meeting from an obligations perspective. But then also broadening out our understanding, what are other employers typically doing beyond award is also important.
Well, there's been so much talk in the media these days about the rise of inflation and of course the rise of the cost of living and all that kind of thing. And in fact, the Fair Work Commission has ruled a $40 a week pay rise for minimum wage earners. Should businesses too be prepared to increase salaries of not just their lower wage earners but the whole staff in line with inflation?
I think, again, in order to retain people, there's an element of needing to keep our people pace, up to speed with what it costs to actually live in our particular region. So obviously each city across Australia might have a different level of reality. But again, we need to understand, what does that look like? What does it actually cost our people to live here? And the more we can keep them in line with those changes, the more likely it is that it's actually affordable for them to continue to work for us. So again, this is all about making sure we can retain great people. I think the other element of it quite practically, however, is affordability. I think businesses clearly need to be sustainable. They need to be able to keep the lights on. So as to whether or not everybody gets a pay change or whether or not it's really targeted toward individuals of the team that are making the biggest contribution, those who are mission critical that we need to retain. Sometimes that's the best that we can do, is really be thinking carefully about how we divvy the pie up, if you like, across the group. But, year on year, I think that most human beings, in order to stay in a job, it may not be every year that they're getting some sort of increase in line with inflation, but certainly over a 3-year period, you would expect there's at least been a moment, if not two, where those changes have been made.
Mazars is an international audit, tax and advisory firm committed to helping clients confidently build and grow their businesses. To find out how Mazars can support your business, visit mazars.com.au. That's mazars.com.au.
Well, if we look at that a bit deeper, if a boss is considering offering a pay rise to his or her employees, what should they think about? Is it an automatic thing? Is it something that happens at a particular time of year, and any other issues?
Yeah, I think, it varies from business to business. Some employers will look at everybody's pay on an annual basis. Others will look at it at the time of the anniversary of each individual. So, once they've been there each year on their anniversary, stopping and having a look at it. I think that the advantage of doing it all at once is that we can then go and do our market research, we can do our benchmarking, we can understand what that external landscape is rather than having to do that on a one-to-one basis. And then armed with that data, we can understand, okay, well, what's the salary range or wage range that is typical for a particular job? So like job, like employer in our industry, what does that range look like? Then it's about determining, well, where within that range should somebody reasonably sit? And that's going to come down to a couple of things. It's going to be, as a starting point, their level of experience. So how much knowledge, skill and experience they're actually bringing to the job. Somebody, if you look at, for example, a client service role, they've been in that job for 2 to 3 years, they're a solid performer, so they're meeting your expectations, is probably in most instances that 50th percentile of that market range is your starting point. That's where we know that 50% might pay more, but 50% are paying less, and this is a solid contributor. Then it's about thinking, who are our overperformers, so the people who are bringing more. And that's where we need to make decisions around how competitive do we want to be. Do we want to be paying at the 75th percentile, for example, of that range to make sure that there's far fewer employers that are going to potentially poach that person and pay them more money? Rarely do I see it as being necessary to pay people at the 100th percentile. I think that there is a lot more that people take into consideration. It's not just about pay. So long as our pay is competitive, that, people believe that it's a fair and reasonable reflection of what they bring, what their level of experience and performance is, then it becomes a neutral factor in terms of motivating engagement and performance. People will also take into account the culture of the environment, the career advancement opportunities, the ability to learn and grow, how much they just like working with their colleagues. All of those things start to play out as well in terms of people's decisions. So, again, understand the range, understand the logical point where an individual should sit within it, and just make sure that your confidence competitive relative to that depth of talent.
What if an employee asks for a pay rise, but you're not willing to give one? Either you can't afford it or they don't deserve it, or both.
Yeah, I think this is when we have to have the challenging conversation, but I think we also need to have conviction, but we also need to have clarity. So being willing to have a conversation around why. And if it is affordability of the business, then be able to articulate why that is. Also give people insight to when you anticipate it may be more reasonable in terms of timing to do that review. So to say a flat no is risky. People will then most likely start to look externally as to whether or not there are other opportunities for them. If it is performance related, then again, I think we need to have the courage to look people in the eye and say, we don't believe that you are contributing at a standard that requires a higher rate of compensation for that performance. And if we've done our benchmarking, we understand what the external world is paying, we're in a far stronger position to have these conversations. Look, we understand what the typical pay rate is for this job. We are confident that you are earning a competitive salary already. And then it's about helping people to understand what else would they need to do in order to be bringing greater value and therefore justify an increase. And that might be around furthering their capabilities, it might be around lifting their performance, it might be obviously undertaking greater qualifications. So helping people to see the path from where they are to where they want to be from an income perspective. If employees are asking me this question around how do I ask for a pay rise, my advice always is focus on your value to the business. How has that changed? How has that increased? What justifies the fact that, you are having a greater influence or impact on the success of the organisation and therefore deserve to share in the upside? It shouldn't just be about, well, I've got more bills at home or I want to earn more money. That's not necessarily going to convince an employer that that's necessary.
Well, any final thoughts, Karen, on what businesses should know about when it comes to giving pay rises?
Yeah, I just want to reinforce that, if we are doing our research and we understand where we sit in the market, we're in a much stronger position to have these types of conversations and to build some rhythm around it, and rather than just doing it on an ad hoc basis. waiting for people to put their hand up. Take a moment in time at some point in the year to stop, reflect, okay, what is the benchmark data telling us and what does that mean for the people within our organisation? There are plenty of freely available surveys, that give insight to salary levels. So we've already talked about award data, but you can also tap into often large recruitment firms will have salary data that they're releasing on a regular basis. You don't necessarily have to go and engage a professional services firm to give you that information. There are people out there that provide data that help you to work through that process if it's something you want to invest in. But in my experience, look for 2 or 3 independent sources of insight. That might be jumping onto Seek, having a look at, okay, what's the typical going rate here in terms of those advertised rates, looking at those freely available surveys, potentially even talking to recruiters that you work with. What are they experiencing around the job level, the pay level for that particular job? So get your 3 independent sources and then make a judgment call. What do you think the range is looking like and where do I need to put somebody within that?
That was Karen Gately, CEO of Corporate Dojo. This episode of Business Essentials Daily is produced by the team at SoundCartel. Thanks for listening. I'm Nicole Goodman. We'll bring you more Be Daily tomorrow. Follow at BE Daily Podcast across social media and head to bedaily.com.au for more from the Business Essentials Daily podcast. SoundCartel. This episode was brought to you by Mazars. To find out more, visit mazars.com.au. That's mazars.com.au.